The quiet didn't come all at once. It crept in after the noise died, after the shouting that never really happened, after the questions I never asked, after the life I thought was solid dissolved without warning. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table when I realized something was wrong. Not dramatically. No slammed doors. No final argument. Just my phone glowing in the dark, refreshing a banking app like it might suddenly apologize. Account unavailable. I stared at those 2 words longer than I should have. Long enough for denial to form excuses. A system glitch. Scheduled maintenance. A mistake that would fix itself if I waited. But waiting had always been my specialty. And waiting was how I got here. The house felt larger than it ever had before. Every sound echoed. The refrigerator hum, the ticking clock on the wall she insisted we buy because it looked mature. The clock kept moving. My life didn't. I refreshed again. Same message. Then a notification slid in, calm and merciless. Your divorce filing has been submitted. No call. No conversation. Just a legal confirmation that the woman I shared a bed with for 11 years had decided to erase me between meetings. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I sat there, elbows on the table, hands locked together like I was praying to a god I stopped believing in years ago. My chest tightened, not with anger, but with embarrassment. The kind that sinks deeper than rage. Because some part of me already knew. I scrolled through recent transactions. At first, the numbers didn't register. Too big. Too clean. Transfers spaced out carefully, like footsteps meant not to be heard. Then my brain caught up, and the air left my lungs. $6.7 million. Not lost. Not invested poorly. I felt smaller with every swipe. Like I was shrinking backward through my own life, watching moments replay with new meaning. The late nights she claimed were strategy sessions. The way she'd tilt her phone away when I walked into the room. How she'd started calling our money my responsibility. I had trusted her because trusting was easier than questioning. Because questioning might have required me to admit I wasn't in control of anything that mattered. The name of the attorney handling the divorce sat at the bottom of the filing. I recognized it immediately. I'd met him once at a charity dinner. Too confident. Too relaxed around her. The way his hand rested on the small of her back just a second too long. Back then, I told myself I was being paranoid. Now, it felt like I'd been sleepwalking through my own humiliation. My phone buzzed again. A text from her. This doesn't have to be ugly. I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because something inside me finally cracked. Ugly had already happened. Ugly was realizing the person you defended to your friends had been planning your exit while you were busy being reasonable. I typed a response. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that, too. In the end, I sent nothing. Silence had always been my contribution to conflict. Silence, I told myself, was maturity. It was restraint. It was strength. But sitting there, alone in that kitchen, I finally understood the truth. Silence was permission. Call the bank. The hold music was upbeat, insulting. When a human voice finally came on the line, I gave my information and waited for the explanation that would put everything back where it belonged. There was a pause. Then the representative cleared his throat. Sir, there's something else tied to your profile. Something in his tone made my spine straighten. What kind of something? I asked. An older account, he said carefully. It's unusual. It's been dormant for decades. I frowned. That's impossible. It's under your family name, he continued. Established in 1960. My grandfather. The word landed heavier than I expected. He died when I was 25. A quiet man. Disciplined. The kind of person who never raised his voice but somehow commanded the room anyway. He believed in preparation, in patience, in not explaining yourself to people who hadn't earned it. I'd always thought his habits were outdated. Paranoid even. Now, with my marriage in ruins and my finances stripped clean by the woman who once swore loyalty, the idea that something of his still existed, untouched, felt unreal. Why am I only hearing about this now? I asked. Another pause. Because no one's tried to access it before, the representative said. and because it wasn't designed to be found casually. The call ended with more questions than answers. But when I set the phone down, the room felt different. The silence shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. A moment later, another message came in from my wife. "You'll be fine," she wrote. "You always land on your feet." I stared at that line until my vision blurred. She believed it. She truly believed I'd just adapt. Absorb the loss. Rebuild quietly. The same way I always had. The same way I'd bent my life around hers, smoothing every rough edge so she could stand taller. For the first time, something inside me refused. I didn't feel strong yet. I didn't feel confident. But beneath the shock and grief, there was a thin thread of awareness pulling tight. I had spent years being the man who kept things from breaking. And now that everything had broken anyway, I was finally free to ask a dangerous question. Who was I without the role I played for everyone else? Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the street, someone laughed. Life moved on, indifferent to my collapse. I stood up from the table and walked through the house slowly, noticing details I'd ignored for years. The framed photos that told a story of stability. The furniture chosen for appearances, not comfort. A life curated to look successful while quietly draining the man living inside it. I stopped in the hallway and caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't recognize the man staring back. But for the first time, I didn't look away. If there was truly something my grandfather had left behind, something untouched by betrayal and manipulation, then it wasn't just money. It was a test. And as the silence settled around me again, deeper and heavier than before, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was the last night I would let my life be decided without my consent. The account from 1960 was still a mystery. But whatever it was waiting. I used to believe becoming an adult meant learning how to compromise. What no one ever told me was how easily compromise turns into erasure. The night after I learned about the account, I didn't sleep. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle like it was exhaling years of tension I hadn't noticed carrying. Every creak felt like a memory shifting into place, lining up with a clarity that made my chest ache. I kept replaying moments I'd dismissed at the time. Conversations where I nodded instead of pushing back. Decisions I framed as teamwork but were really surrender. I told myself I was being mature. Supportive. The kind of man women said they wanted. What I became instead was predictable. I thought about my career first. I hadn't failed, not technically. On paper, I was successful. Stable income. Respectable title. The kind of job relatives brag about without understanding what it actually costs. But I remembered the offer I turned down at 31. Risky. Lower base pay. High upside if it worked. I'd been excited, terrified, alive. She sat across from me at this same kitchen table, arms crossed, calm but decisive. "Why would you gamble when we're finally comfortable?" she asked. I didn't argue. I told myself comfort mattered more than ambition. That security was love in a practical form. What I didn't admit was that I was afraid. Afraid of failing. Afraid of proving I wasn't as capable as I wanted to believe. Afraid that if I chased something for myself and lost, I'd lose her too. So I stayed. And staying became a pattern. I remembered how decisions in our marriage slowly stopped sounding like questions. We should move closer to the city. We should consolidate accounts. We should let me handle the finances. You hate dealing with that stuff. Each sentence wore the costume of logic. Each one chipped away at something I couldn't name at the time. My silence filled the gaps. I told myself I was choosing peace. That avoiding conflict meant preserving love. That strong men didn't need to win every argument. But peace built on avoidance is fragile. It looks solid until pressure hits it from the wrong angle. Around 3 in the morning, I went into the garage and sat in my car with the door closed, just to feel like I was somewhere neutral. The smell of oil and old cardboard grounded me. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and let the truth surface without fighting it. I had been disappearing for years. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Quietly. Conveniently. In ways that made everyone else's life smoother while mine shrank to maintenance mode. I thought about my grandfather then, not as an idea, but as a man. How he spoke slowly, deliberately. How he never rushed to fill silence. How people leaned in when he finally did speak. He used to say something when I was younger. I'd brushed it off as old-fashioned stubbornness. Agreement isn't the same as respect, he told me once, tightening a bolt with hands that never shook. Men confuse the two and wonder why they wake up angry at 40. At the time I laughed. Now, the words landed like a verdict. Near sunrise, I found myself digging through a box in the closet marked old stuff. Inside were things I hadn't touched in years. College notebooks, expired passports, random cables I'd convinced myself might be useful again. At the bottom was a small cassette tape in a cracked plastic case. My grandfather's handwriting. I didn't remember ever listening to it. It took me an hour to find a player that still worked. When I finally pressed play, the sound crackled before his voice came through, steady, unhurried, unmistakable. If you're hearing this, he said, it means I'm gone. And it means you're old enough to understand why some things are kept quiet. I sat on the floor, back against the couch, heart pounding. He didn't talk about money. Not directly. He talked about pressure. About patience. About how men give up leverage long before they lose freedom, usually because they want to be liked. Don't confuse peace with safety, he said. Peace can be negotiated away. Safety comes from knowing where you stand and being willing to stay there. The tape ended abruptly. No goodbye. No explanation. I sat there long after the silence returned, realizing something uncomfortable. The betrayal didn't start when my wife stole the money. It started when I trained her to believe I would never resist. That realization hurt more than the divorce filing. More than the empty accounts. Because it stripped me of the easy narrative where I was purely the victim. I had participated. Not maliciously. Not knowingly. But consistently. Later that morning, sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the life I'd built by deferring my own voice. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to clean it up or make it presentable. I made coffee and drank it standing up, like I was already halfway out the door of a version of myself that no longer fit. I didn't know yet what the account from 1960 meant. I didn't know if it would save me or complicate everything. But I knew this. Whatever came next, I couldn't survive it as the man who stayed quiet to keep the peace. That man had already lost everything. And as the morning settled in, heavy with consequence and possibility, I made a decision so small it barely felt like one. The next time someone told me what we should do, I wouldn't nod. I would speak, even if my voice shook. I didn't walk into the bank expecting hope. Hope felt irresponsible, like optimism without evidence. What I expected was paperwork, confusion, maybe another polite apology explaining why nothing could be done. I expected to be reminded, again, that systems favor those who plan exits instead of futures. The building smelled like disinfectant and old money. Neutral colors. Soft lighting designed to make you feel safe while quietly reminding you who actually held the power. I sat across from a man in a tailored suit who spoke carefully, like every word had already been approved by a legal department. He slid a folder across the table. I should be clear, he said. This account shouldn't exist in any normal sense. I waited. It was opened in 1960, he continued, tapping the file, under a private trust structure that predates most modern regulations. It's been dormant, untouched, and intentionally invisible. Invisible. The word echoed louder than it should have. I'd spent years perfecting invisibility myself, staying agreeable, staying useful, staying quiet. Now here was proof that invisibility, used correctly, could be something else entirely. He explained the mechanics, but I only half listened. Land royalties. Long-term industrial leases. Reinvested dividends layered carefully over decades. Not flashy. Not aggressive. Just patient. The balance numbers sat on the page like it didn't belong to me. Too large. Too composed. Like it had been waiting for someone steadier than the man I currently was. This account was designed to survive, he said. Economic downturns. Legal disputes. Even family conflict. I almost laughed. My grandfather hadn't been paranoid. He'd been precise. Why wasn't I notified when my other accounts were accessed? I asked. The banker hesitated just long enough to matter. Because this account doesn't behave like your others, he said. And because, frankly, if certain parties become aware of it prematurely, they could attempt to challenge its standing. Certain parties. My wife's lawyer appeared in my mind immediately. His voice. His certainty. The way he'd looked at me during that dinner years ago like I was a temporary inconvenience. So what happens now? I asked. He leaned back slightly. Now, you decide how visible you want to be. The words landed heavier than any balance sheet. Visibility had always cost me. It led to arguments I didn't want. Expectations I wasn't sure I could meet. Being seen meant being judged. But invisibility had cost me everything else. He slid another document forward. A clause highlighted in yellow. Direct descendant verification, he said. Biometric confirmation, personal affidavit, and, this is important, intent declaration. Intent? He nodded. This account activates fully only when the beneficiary declares purpose. Not use. Purpose. I felt my jaw tighten. My grandfather hadn't just hidden money. He'd hidden a standard. I left the bank with copies of documents I wasn't sure I was ready to sign and a warning I couldn't ignore. If your wife's legal team discovers this before you establish standing, the banker said as we stood, they will attempt to frame it as marital property by association. On the drive home, every traffic light felt personal. Every delay felt like exposure. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting someone to be following me, not physically, but legally. That night, I spread the papers across the kitchen table. The same table where I'd nodded my way out of my own life. The same surface where comfort had been chosen over courage. I read every line slowly. This wasn't a lifeline. It was leverage. And leverage only works if you're willing to use it. My phone buzzed while I was reading. A message from an unknown number. We need to talk about a fair settlement. I knew who it was. The confidence behind the words irritated me more than the threat. Fair, to him, meant efficient. It meant closing the door before I realized I could block it. I typed back one sentence. I'm reviewing my options. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Don't complicate this, the reply came. You're not built for prolonged conflict. I set the phone face down. That assumption, that I would fold, was the foundation of everything they'd done. I poured myself a drink I didn't want and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere out there, my wife was probably confident, rehearsing justifications, telling herself a story where she was practical and I was weak. For the first time, that story didn't feel inevitable. I thought about the cassette tape, about my grandfather's voice warning me that leverage disappears when men give it away voluntarily. I wasn't ready to reveal the account. Not yet. But I wasn't going to hide from it either. I pulled out a notebook and wrote a single sentence across the first page. I will not move until I understand what I'm standing on. The words steadied me. This account wasn't a miracle. It was a mirror. It showed me what patience looked like when it was paired with intention. What restraint could become when it wasn't fueled by fear. As I gathered the papers back into the folder, I understood the real danger wasn't losing the money. It was becoming visible too soon, or too late. And as the night closed in, carrying with it the quiet pressure of decisions I could no longer avoid, one truth settled into place. Whatever came next, I wouldn't be reacting anymore. I would be choosing. Pressure doesn't announce itself. It shows up disguised as courtesy, as deadlines that sound reasonable, as people telling you they're just trying to help while quietly tightening the walls around you. By the end of the week, the messages started arriving with professional warmth and legal precision. Emails from my wife's attorney outlining timelines. Calls from numbers I didn't recognize that never left voicemails. Every contact carried the same subtext. This will go easier if you cooperate. I had spent most of my adult life cooperating. Now it felt like a trap closing from every direction. I met with my own attorney on a Tuesday morning in an office that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. He was competent, cautious, and already overwhelmed. As he flipped through my documents, his brow furrowed deeper with each page. "They've moved fast," he said finally. "And aggressively." "That's their style," I replied. He glanced up at me. You sound like you expected this. I did. Because people don't betray you impulsively at this level. They prepare. They test boundaries. They wait until they're sure you won't push back. He explained the situation plainly. Asset freezes. Discovery motions. The likelihood they'd try to force a settlement before I fully understood what had been taken from me. And the old account? He asked carefully. I hesitated. Not disclosed yet, I said. And I want to keep it that way. His eyes narrowed. That's risky. So is showing my cards to people who already stacked the deck, I replied. He didn't argue. He didn't reassure me either. Instead, he leaned back and sighed. You're playing defense with no armor, he said. If they push hard enough, they could bury you in procedure alone. That was the point. They weren't trying to beat me in court. They were trying to exhaust me into agreement. On my way out, I passed my reflection in the elevator doors. I looked composed, presentable, like a man handling his affairs responsibly. Inside, I felt like I was standing in the open during a storm, pretending I wasn't getting soaked. The first real confrontation came 2 days later. She called. I stared at her name on the screen longer than necessary, then answered. We don't need to do this the hard way, she said without greeting. Her voice was calm, almost kind. The same tone she used when she'd already decided. You already chose the hard way, I said. The pause. Then a sigh. You're being emotional, she replied. This is business. There was the justification that let her sleep at night. I trusted you, I said quietly. And I handled things, she shot back. You hate dealing with details. You always have. That sentence cut deeper than the accusation. Because it was partly true. I had let her handle things. I had stepped back. But that didn't make what she did acceptable. It wasn't your money to move, I said. Silence stretched between us. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Sharper. Defensive. You're not equipped for a prolonged fight, she said. Let my lawyer handle this. You'll walk away comfortable. Comfortable. The word felt hollow now. Like a bribe meant for a man who no longer existed. I'm not agreeing to anything yet, I said. You're making a mistake, she replied. Men like you don't survive scorched earth. The line stayed with me long after the call ended. Men like you. That was how they saw me. Predictable. Passive. Too reasonable to resist being overrun. That night, I spread out the legal documents again. This time, I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was looking for weakness. Buried in the filings was a misclassification. A small one. Easy to miss. An assumption that certain assets existed only within the timeline of our marriage. It was subtle. And it was wrong. I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years. Focus. Not hope. Not anger. Clarity. They were moving fast because they believed speed would overwhelm me. They believed pressure would make me revert to the man who nodded and signed. But pressure also reveals cracks. I forwarded the document to my attorney with a single note. Check page 14. Timeline assumption. He called me within the hour. Where did you find this? He asked. I stopped trying to keep the peace, I replied. For the first time since this began, his voice carried something close to optimism. This could slow them down, he said. Force them to explain. Slowing them down was enough, for now. I wasn't winning. But I wasn't drowning either. Later, alone in the house, I poured another drink and didn't touch it. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by objects chosen to signal success, and felt something unfamiliar settle into my chest. I was still afraid. But fear no longer owned the room. I didn't have armor. I didn't have certainty. And I definitely didn't have mercy waiting on the other side of this fight. What I had was awareness. And as I turned off the lights and let the house fall back into shadow, one thought repeated with steady insistence. They thought I was defending. They had no idea I was learning how to stand. I woke that morning with a strange sort of quiet. Not peace. Not clarity. Just a quiet that felt like the space between storms, when the air tastes like electricity and everything is waiting. I pulled the cassette tape from the nightstand and pressed it into the player again. My grandfather's voice filled the room with that calm authority I had ignored for decades. Patience, He said, almost like a mantra. Patience paired with awareness is power. Silence without observation is weakness. Men who endure understand the difference. The words struck differently now. I had spent my life nodding and observing, watching others decide, defer, dictate, waiting for permission, waiting for circumstances to prove themselves safe. Endurance had been passive for me. I thought patience meant sitting quietly and accepting whatever came my way. But endurance was active. I listened carefully, letting each phrase land. He talked about leverage, about timing, about the importance of understanding the full shape of conflict before entering it. Every anecdote was precise, deliberate, a template not for surviving life's small inconveniences, but its cataclysmic upheavals. By the time the tape ended, I wasn't the same man who had walked into this week thinking his life could be stripped away without recourse. I wasn't the man who had sat and waited for instructions from others. I was a man considering leverage. The old account from 1960 wasn't simply a repository of money. It was a repository of intention. My grandfather hadn't wanted to save me from misfortune. He had wanted to teach me control, patience, strategy. I spread the legal documents across the table again, feeling a sense of weight, less than panic, more than responsibility. Each sheet of paper represented both threat and opportunity. But now I had context. I had history. I had rules inherited quietly through decades. One line in the documents made my pulse quicken. A clause, buried in legalese, confirming the account's protection against claims before its proper activation. This wasn't just money untouched. It was a standard, a test of endurance, intelligence, and foresight. And I had passed the first measure by simply noticing it. The realization hit me slowly. My grandfather had anticipated not just financial turbulence, but relational betrayal. He had built in safeguards against manipulation, against those who assumed I would always defer, against people like my wife's lawyer lover. I took the phone and dialed my attorney. He answered with the usual measured tone. "I've been reviewing the 1960 account and the trust structure," I said. "I want to proceed carefully, but I also want to understand all possible moves before they even know it exists." His pause was telling. "That's prudent," he said finally. "Most people rush in. Most lose sight of the leverage." I smiled faintly. Not because I felt safe, but because I finally understood what I was standing on. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was preparing to act from a position of deliberate strength. Later that day, I found a worn notebook in my grandfather's desk drawer, filled with meticulous handwriting. It contained principles, maxims, and cryptic instructions. Most were simple in appearance but profound in application. Observe before acting, never reveal your assets prematurely, understand the intentions of everyone around you, and, above all, know your own purpose. I read until my eyes burned, letting each line resonate. One sentence at the end caught me and refused to let go. "You'll know when it's time to stop running." I sat back in the chair and let the words sink in. Running. I had spent years running. From conflict. From exposure. From my own ambitions. From myself. I would run no longer. The house, quiet for once, felt like a rehearsal stage. The papers, the tape, the notes, they were props in a performance I was just beginning to understand. I was learning a new rhythm, a measured pace. The old rules, deference, compromise, avoidance, would not guide me anymore. Instead, I had inherited a methodology. A map that connected patience to power, silence to observation, restraint to strategy. And as I reviewed every document, every legal clause, every note, one truth became irrefutable. I could not react. I had to anticipate. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind. "Men who endure understand the difference." I closed the notebook and sat in silence, letting the quiet settle around me like a cloak. Fear was still present. Anxiety hadn't evaporated. But it was no longer commanding the room. It was a signal. A reminder to act with precision. The next steps would not be easy. There would be confrontation. There would be exposure. There would be danger in miscalculation. But I wasn't the man who fled from challenges anymore. I was the man who learned the rules. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was ready to endure on my own terms. I put the folder into a secure briefcase, taking a deep breath. Outside, the world moved forward, unaware of the quiet preparation happening inside these walls. I wasn't just waiting anymore. I was ready to act. And when the time came to reveal what had been hidden, I would do it not out of desperation, but out of strategy, patience, and control. I never thought a single decision could feel like both a liberation and a weight pressing against my chest. The morning air was crisp, but the tension inside me was hotter than summer. I had reviewed the documents countless times, traced every clause, every footnote, every subtle loophole left by my grandfather. By now, the strategy was no longer theoretical, it was actionable. The first call came from my attorney. He was measured, careful, but I could hear the curiosity in his tone. He knew I was no longer the man who would simply comply. "You're ready to act?" he asked. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but out of recognition of the consequences. This wasn't just a move in court. This was a declaration of intent. "Yes," I said. "I'm ready to choose the fight." The words felt heavier than they should have, and lighter at the same time. Lighter because, finally, I was moving on my own terms. The first step was procedural, filing a motion to establish the 1960 account as a protected asset outside the marital property claims. My attorney drafted the paperwork with precision. I watched each line, each term, each clause. Every word had to be deliberate, because one mistake would unravel the entire strategy. When the documents were finally ready, I signed them with a sense of purpose that had been absent for years. Every stroke of the pen felt like reclaiming a fragment of myself. I sent them off and then waited, not for a response, but for confirmation that I had taken the first real step in reclaiming my life. Waiting was a new form of power now. It wasn't anxiety. It was calculation. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. The unknown number appeared again. "Private meeting. We need to talk." I didn't hesitate this time. I knew exactly who it was. Or rather, her proxy, the lawyer lover who had orchestrated so much. I agreed. The meeting was tense but controlled. I didn't let anger dictate my words. I kept my voice measured, steady, the way my grandfather had taught me by example and by tape. "You underestimated me," I said. He smirked, probably thinking he still held the upper hand. "You assumed I would panic. Take the easy way out," I continued. "But that's not who I am anymore." I watched his smirk falter. For a fraction of a second, he realized he had misread me. The conversation ended with nothing resolved, on the surface. But I knew it had shifted. The perception of control had changed. That night, I sat alone with the 1960 account documents spread before me. This wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was a tangible assertion of agency I hadn't felt in years. I allowed myself a moment of reflection, letting the weight of the fight settle into a clear focus. I had chosen to confront, to assert, to reclaim. Every fear, every hesitation, every doubt had been processed and transformed into strategy. The act of choosing had empowered me. It reminded me that power was not about aggression or retaliation. It was about awareness, patience, and precise execution. And as I put the documents into a secure briefcase, I felt a strange calm. Not the calm of ignorance, but the calm of preparation. The calm of knowing that when the confrontation escalated, and it would, I would meet it with clarity and purpose. I poured a drink, not out of despair, but as a silent acknowledgement of the path I had chosen. Every choice from here on would be deliberate. Every step calculated. Every reaction intentional. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt in control, not over outcomes, but over myself. That control was enough. As the night deepened, I glanced at the city outside my window. Lights flickered across buildings like small promises, each one indifferent to my personal struggle. And yet, I felt connected to something larger, the endurance, patience, and strategy my grandfather had instilled. The legacy I was finally beginning to inhabit fully. I had chosen the fight. And in that choice, I had already won something far greater than money or legal leverage. I had won myself. The day arrived with the kind of clarity that made the air itself feel sharper. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I knew stakes were higher than ever, not just money, but pride, identity, and the measure of the man I had become. But I also knew there was no turning back. I entered the law office, briefcase in hand, careful not to reveal too much. Inside, they were already waiting, her, calm as always, and the lawyer who had orchestrated my humiliation with a practiced smile. "Sit," he said, waving me toward a chair. But this time, I chose where to stand. I didn't sit. I let them feel the tension I carried, the certainty of a man who had measured every angle and was ready. She looked at me, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Perhaps she expected me to be timid, to bargain, to apologize. But no, there was nothing to apologize for, only to confront. "I know everything," I said quietly. Not accusing, just stating fact. The transfers, the accounts, the intentions behind them. You underestimated me. You counted on my silence, my compliance. That stops today. Her lawyer interjected, attempting calm. "We can settle this." "Settle?" I interrupted, my voice steady, controlled. "This isn't about settling. This is about clarifying the boundaries you overstepped, about acknowledging the leverage I have and the mistakes you made in assuming you could control me." I watched as their expressions shifted. Confidence replaced by calculation, a subtle hesitation. They were accustomed to walking over me. They were not accustomed to this clarity. I laid out the 1960 account documentation with deliberate care. Each page highlighted, every clause explained. I wasn't aggressive. I was precise. Immovable. "This account," I said, tapping the top sheet, "was never meant to be a safety net for me alone. It was a standard, a test, and I passed. Now, the choice to respect that standard, or face its legal implications, is yours." There was silence. A long, uncomfortable pause where the balance of power had shifted. She tried to respond, but I held her gaze. Not anger. Not triumph. Just the stillness of a man who had endured, observed, and acted deliberately. Her lawyer finally spoke, voice tighter than before. "Need to review this." "Take all the time you need," I said. "But remember, the clock started the moment this account became visible. Your assumptions about my reactions are no longer valid." I left the office with a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. Not over them. Not over the account. But over myself. Every step measured. Every thought deliberate. Every decision mine. Driving home, I reflected on the journey. Betrayal, loss, silence, endurance, all the experiences that had led me here. Each one had been a teacher, a preparation for this exact moment. And now, the confrontation had revealed the ultimate truth. My power existed not in reaction, but in readiness. That night, alone in the house, I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I allowed myself a deep breath, the first in weeks that felt unencumbered by fear or doubt. The fight wasn't over, legally. But emotionally, I had won. I had reclaimed my agency. My voice. My presence. I understood that confrontation isn't about annihilation, it's about assertion. About making clear that boundaries exist and that crossing them has consequences. The silence that followed was different this time. Not the quiet of submission or defeat. Not the oppressive hush of betrayal. It was quiet of acknowledgement, of recognition, of respect, not freely given, but earned through endurance and deliberate action. As I looked out at the city, the lights flickering like distant witnesses, I felt a profound sense of equilibrium. For the first time since the betrayal, I felt whole. Not because the past was rewritten, but because I had chosen how to meet it. And in that moment, I realized the final lesson my grandfather had intended for me. Power is not in what you hold, but in who you become in response to what you lose. The morning light filtered through the blinds, cutting the shadows in straight lines across the floor. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the weight of anticipation pressing on my chest. The confrontation was over. The leverage had been established. The path forward, while not entirely free of obstacles, was mine to navigate. I walked into the kitchen and sat at the same table where my silence had once allowed betrayal to flourish. It felt different now. Not a place of regret, but a place of reckoning and understanding. I thought about everything that had led me here. The stolen millions, the manipulations, the lies. The years of quiet compliance. The moments when I chose peace over confrontation, comfort over assertion. Every choice, every compromise, every painful lesson had shaped me, but none had defined me. Not permanently. I poured myself a coffee and let the steam rise, breathing it in like a ritual of clarity. I realized that I hadn't just been reclaiming money or legal leverage. I had been reclaiming myself. I took out my grandfather's notes one last time, flipping through the dog-eared pages. The maxims, the rules, the cryptic instructions, they all converged into a simple truth. Strength isn't measured by what you defend, but by the integrity and intentionality of how you act when everything else is stripped away. I smiled faintly, thinking of my grandfather's voice on the tape. You'll know when it's time to stop running. I had known. And I had stopped. Not out of fear, not out of pressure, but out of deliberate choice. The phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. It was her this time. There was a pause before she spoke, an unfamiliar hesitation that replaced the usual confidence in her tone. I think we need to discuss the terms, she said cautiously. I listened, feeling no panic, no rush. I had all the time I needed now, and my position had shifted. I was no longer the man who reacted blindly. I was the man who acted from understanding and strategy. I'm listening, I replied calmly. But understand this. The boundaries and the leverage have been clearly established. Everything from here on out will proceed within those parameters. She hesitated, and I could sense the realization dawning. The game had changed. I had changed. After the call, I set the phone down and walked to the window, looking out at the city that had once felt indifferent, distant, even threatening. Now it seemed expansive, full of possibility, quiet in a way that encouraged reflection rather than despair. I allowed myself a moment to acknowledge the man I had become. Not perfect, not unflinching, not immune to fear, but deliberate, observant, empowered by knowledge, tempered by patience, and guided by clarity. I thought of my grandfather again and the legacy he had left, not just of financial prudence, but of emotional resilience. I realized that the 1960 account was never just money. It was a template for endurance, for strategic patience, for knowing when to act and when to observe. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of completion. The betrayal had not been erased, nor the losses reversed. But they had been reframed. Every wound had been transformed into insight. Every moment of fear had been processed into clarity. Every hesitation had taught me a rule of engagement I would carry forward. I poured another cup of coffee and sat in silence, letting the room and the quiet absorb into me. I didn't feel relief, exactly. Relief implies the temporary easing of pressure. This was something more permanent. Acceptance. Mastery over self. Knowledge that I could endure, act, and reclaim, not just possessions, but the essence of who I was. The house, once a symbol of passive compliance, now felt like a stage for agency. Every object, every shadow, every sound reminded me of the journey, from betrayal to awareness, from silence to assertion, from fear to strategic confidence. I took a deep breath and allowed myself a smile, small but genuine. The fight had been hard, the lessons painful, the journey unforgiving. But I had emerged not just intact, but transformed. I stood and looked around one last time, knowing the next steps would require the same patience, strategy, and self-assurance that had brought me here. The world outside hadn't changed. The challenges hadn't disappeared. But I had changed, and that made all the difference. I was no longer the man who sat silently while life was stolen from him. I was the man who chose when to act, how to act, and why to act. I was finally, undeniably myself. And in that realization, I found a quiet, unshakable peace.